You know, when you hear a title like The Crown Prince of Reggae, you probably picture a very specific kind of life. Like you imagine this massive legacy, right?
Right, yeah. Royalty.
Exactly. A long, revered reign over an empire of sound. What you don't picture, though, is an artist dead at just 42 years old, leaving behind this swirl of tragic rumors and an incredibly complicated legacy.
It's a really jarring contrast. I mean, the title implies this level of invincibility, like he was
Yeah.
protected, but the reality of his end points to extreme vulnerability.
Yeah.
He was surrounded by people, yet completely exposed.
Yeah, and that is exactly what we are exploring today. We are taking a deep dive into the transcript of a documentary video from the Reggae Stars channel.
A really fascinating source, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at the life, the meteoric rise, and the deeply troubling fall of Dennis Brown. Our mission here isn't just to, walk you through a discography. We want to uncover the actual mechanisms behind his sudden death and try to understand the immense, crushing pressure placed on a child prodigy who essentially grew up on a public stage. Okay, let's unpack this.
Because to understand how his life ended, we really have to look closely at the environment that built him. His trajectory wasn't just fast. I mean, it was entirely consuming from an age when most kids are just, learning basic life skills.
Right. So we're going to take you on a journey. We'll start in the vibrant, hyper-competitive heart of Jamaica's music scene in the late 1960s, track his climb to the international pop charts, and examine the industry exploitation that turned his success into a cautionary tale.
It really is a cautionary tale.
It is. So let's set the scene. Kingston, Jamaica, 1957. Dennis Brown is born into a family that already understands performance. His father, Arthur, was a working actor, and his brother, Basil, was a comedian.
And crucially, he grew up right near Orange Street.
Oh, Beat Street.
Exactly, Beat Street. In the context of Jamaican music history, you can think of it as the absolute nerve center of the recording industry during the 60s and 70s.
So he was literally soaking it in from the moment he could walk. The sources describe this young kid heavily influenced by the smooth delivery of American crooners like Nat King Cole just singing out in his yard.
Yeah.
And he's so naturally gifted that relatives and neighbors would actually throw pennies into the yard just to hear him sing. I mean, he was a local attraction before he was even 10 years old.
Which sounds charming,
Right.
as a childhood anecdote,
Yeah.
but it establishes a very dangerous precedent early on. From his earliest conscious memories, his innate talent, his actual physical voice is intrinsically tied to currency.
Wow, yeah.
It's a performance for immediate financial reward.
And that escalated quickly. By age 9, he is performing formally on stage. By 11, he's at a venue called the Tit for Tat Club in West Kingston, backed by a major house band, the Fabulous Falcons.
A huge deal at the time.
Totally. He actually impresses bandleader Byron Lee so much that he gets booked on major regional shows. And then, at 12 years old, he crosses paths with Clement Dodd.
Clement Coxone Dodd is just a titan of the industry. He brings young Dennis into the legendary Studio One. And for those who might not know, Studio One was essentially the Motown of Jamaica.
Right, the hit factory.
Exactly. It was responsible for shaping the entire sound of early reggae and rocksteady.
A hit factory where a 12-year-old child was suddenly put to work. He records his first massive hit, No Man is an Island, and it becomes a huge success by late 1969. Over the next brief period, he cuts roughly 30 tracks for Studio One.
30 tracks at 12.
Yeah, I really want to put that into perspective for you.
Hmm.
Imagine a modern middle schooler, like just a 7th grader, and somewhere between finishing their math homework and going to gym class, they are casually churning out billboard-topping, culturally defining hits for a major record label. It requires a level of maturity that simply shouldn't be asked of a child.
What's fascinating here is how this environment completely short-circuits normal psychological development. When you are a child star operating at that elite level, your entire formative growth becomes tied directly to your economic output for adult producers.
He didn't even have a chance to be a kid.
No, Dennis wasn't afforded the luxury of just being a kid figuring out his own identity. He was a highly valuable asset in a famously cutthroat business.
Someone did look out for him, though. Fellow artist Alton Ellis pulls him aside and gives him a vital piece of advice. He tells him to learn the guitar so you can write your own songs. Dodd actually buys him a guitar, and Ellis teaches him how to play.
That wasn't just a music lesson, honestly. That was a survival tool.
Oh, absolutely.
Ellis understood the machinery of the Jamaican recording industry better than anyone. He saw that to just be a voice meant you were easily controlled, underpaid, and eventually replaceable. Writing your own music was the only way to gain structural leverage. It gave Dennis a mechanism to eventually steer his own career.
But implementing that leverage came with its own heavy physical toll. Because he started his career when he was practically a toddler, by the time Dennis Brown is a teenager, he isn't a fresh-faced rookie. He is a burned-out industry veteran.
The timeline is staggering to look at. By his mid-teens, he had already been a working professional, subject to the demands of adult producers for half a decade.
Yeah. In 1972, he partners with producer Joe Gibbs and records the original version of Money in My Pocket. It turns him into an absolute touring force, specifically over in the UK. But by 1973, when he is barely 16 years old, he is hospitalized for severe exhaustion.
A 16-year-old hospitalized because his body simply stopped functioning from overwork.
It's wild.
That phrase alone should have been a massive flashing red flag for every adult in his orbit.
The public reaction was pure panic, too. The rumor mill went into overdrive, with people falsely claiming he had tuberculosis or that he only had one lung and was on his deathbed. But the underlying truth was that his physical system simply gave out.
I have to ask you, though, looking at the relentless pace of early 70s reggae production, is it possible that this kind of teenage burnout was absolutely inevitable? Like, was the industry machine literally designed to run these artists into the ground?
Yes, it was an incredibly high-volume, low-margin industry. The standard practice at the time was to pay artists flat upfront fees for their vocals rather than long-term royalties.
Oh, right. So they had to keep recording.
Exactly. Because of that structure, producers needed constant daily output to keep their businesses afloat, and artists needed to record constantly just to make a living wage. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Dennis's reaction to this hospitalization is incredibly telling. He didn't just take a vacation, he recognized the systemic trap.
Yeah, he saw the writing on the wall. He later said about his manager at the time, Winston Holmes, "I was going along with one man's ideas for too long."
He realized he was the engine powering someone else's car. So he launches his own label, DEB Music.
Launching a label at that age is a phenomenal business move, yes. But it was primarily a psychological survival mechanism. It was a teenager desperately trying to claim his own autonomy and, take control over how he was being exploited.
And he doesn't hold back once he has that control. He heads to Lee Scratch Perry's famous Black Ark studio and records Wolf and Leopard. And this isn't just a catchy love song. The lyrics are actively, pointedly calling out criminals who were trying to profit off the Rastafarian movement.
We need to contextualize that, too.
Yeah.
The Rastafarian movement wasn't just a spiritual belief system. It was a socio-political stance advocating for Black empowerment and resistance to oppression. But as reggae grew popular globally, certain individuals started adopting the aesthetics of Rastafari, like the dreadlocks, the language, purely to make money without actually living the principles. Dennis, calling out those grifters, showed a massive leap in his artistic maturity.
He's finding his political and spiritual voice, and the public responds. This culminates in 1977 with his album Visions of Dennis Brown, which the major UK publication Melody Maker voted Reggae Album of the Year.
He successfully transitioned from a child wonder to an autonomous, respected adult artist. That is an incredibly rare pivot in any entertainment field.
Seriously rare.
The public usually refuses to let child stars grow up, but Dennis's sheer talent forced them to respect his evolution.
That newfound creative control, however, catapulted him onto the global stage. And the global stage brings a completely different kind of pressure cooker. By the late 70s, Dennis is living in London, operating DEB Music. He's not just a singer anymore, he's a producer, a label head, signing major artists like Gregory Isaacs.
He was building an institution, which meant the financial responsibilities were no longer just about feeding himself. He was responsible for the livelihoods of other artists and employees.
Yeah, it's a lot of weight. In 1978, a disco mix of Money in My Pocket hits number 14 on the UK Top 40. It is crossing over into soul clubs and rock clubs. In 1979, he lands the cover of NME, and by 1981, he signs a massive international deal with A&M Records.
The corporate strategy there was to make him an international pop superstar by smoothing out his traditional roots reggae sound. They experimented with Lovers Rock, which is a much softer, more romantic style of reggae that appealed to a broader pop demographic, along with R&B and straight pop sounds.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When that A&M deal eventually ends, he heads back to Jamaica. and the musical landscape has completely radically shifted. It's the dancehall era now.
Right, and dancehall wasn't just a new stylistic trend, it was a massive technological shock to the system.
Oh, totally.
Suddenly, the organic, live studio bands of the roots reggae era were being replaced by stark, heavy, computerized drum tracks and synthesizers. Most roots artists from the 70s sounded instantly outdated. They couldn't figure out how to ride those fast digital rhythms.
But Dennis does. He effortlessly pivots. He starts working with top dancehall producers like King Jammy and Gussie Clarke. He drops the massive hit duet Big All Round with Gregory Isaacs. How does a guy known for acoustic roots music survive the synthesizer boom?
It goes back to his early influences. Because he grew up emulating American R&B crooners, his vocal flexibility was far superior to a lot of his peers. He had a melodic adaptability that allowed him to float his smooth, soulful delivery perfectly over those harsh digital beats. It created a brilliant contrast.
He adapts perfectly without ever losing his core identity. He even goes on to secure 2 Grammy nominations later in his career, one in 1994 for Light My Fire, and his final studio album, Let Me Be the One, in 2001. Musically, he was operating at an elite level.
Musically, yes. But if we look at the structural foundation of his life, it was rapidly crumbling. Despite the massive international deals, the constant chart presence, and the relentless touring, he was not financially secure.
There is a quote from the sources that explains this perfectly. His manager at the time, Tommy Cowan, who notably also managed Bob Marley, made a very sharp comparison. He said Bob Marley was a serious, calculating businessman. Dennis, however, was a community person. Cowan said Dennis would earn a large sum of money, and within an hour, he would have given every single cent of it away to people around him.
Think about the crushing weight of that dynamic. Being the community person means you have essentially become a localized welfare system funded entirely by your own vocal cords.
Man, that's heavy.
You are the financial pillar for a vast network of friends, family, and hangers-on. If you give away everything you earn, you never build a safety net. And worse, it creates a vicious, unending cycle of labor. You can never stop touring, because the moment the tour stops, the community goes hungry.
He was treating his body like an ATM for his entourage, and that unending cycle directly paved the way for his physical downfall. He is pushing himself to the absolute brink, playing dozens of shows all over the world, trying to feed the machine. And during one particularly grueling tour, that exhaustion finally catches up to him.
This is where the tragedy truly accelerates. A promoter notices that Dennis is completely depleted, physically unable to perform. Instead of getting him medical help, the promoter threatens to cancel the entire tour if Dennis can't get on stage.
The pressure in that room must have been suffocating. The community back home needs the money. The promoter is threatening his livelihood, and then the promoter offers him a quick fix: cocaine.
It is critical to understand how the drug was framed here. It wasn't presented as a party favor or a recreational vice. The music industry of the time was offering it as a performance-enhancing tool, a purely operational expense to ensure their human asset continued producing capital.
The sources specifically note that Dennis refused at first. He knew better. But the threats mounted, the contractual obligations piled up, and he finally caved just to get through the show. It gave him the immediate energy he needed, but it sparked a severe, long-term addiction to crack cocaine. And here is the truly horrific part. Dennis had suffered from chronic asthma his entire life. Smoking crack actively decimated his already compromised respiratory system.
It's a terrifying paradox. The very instrument that generated his livelihood, his lungs, and his voice was being destroyed by the exact substance he felt he needed to keep that livelihood functioning. He was taking out a high-interest loan on his health, and the debt was compounding rapidly.
And the industry wasn't just passively watching. They were actively managing his decline. There was a dark, open secret among promoters during this era. They would literally lock Dennis inside his dressing room before a show.
Yeah, literally trap him.
Right. They were terrified he would take his cash advance, spend it on drugs, and disappear. So they held him captive to ensure he walked onto the stage. As his health worsened, he gained a terrible reputation for no-shows, and the media viciously roasted him for it, without asking why it was happening.
Which forced him into a state of intense privacy and deep public denial. He couldn't show weakness.
So what does this all mean? In 1996, he sits down for an interview and flat out denies the drug rumors. He says, "If I was on drugs, I would be persona non grata. Show me your company, I'll tell you who you are." He's basically arguing, like, look at my success, look at the respected people I work with. I couldn't possibly be functioning at this level if I was an addict.
This raises an important question about the nature of complicity. The sources mention his close friend, the DJ Ranking Joe, and his own brother, Leroy. They largely turned a blind eye to the severity of the
I
situation.
did.
They publicly defended him by framing his severe addiction as merely a bad habit rather than a fatal systemic disease. Ranking Joe actually argued that Dennis's massive musical contributions to the world outweighed his personal mistakes.
I have to push back on that narrative, though. Are we letting his entourage off the hook too easily here? Ranking Joe is essentially saying, well, he makes great music, so let's ignore the fact that he is dying in front of us. If Dennis was funding the lives of his friends and family, weren't they financially incentivized to keep him on the road, even if it meant looking the other way when he was self-destructing? Did the very people profiting off his talent effectively enable his slow demise?
It's a brutal assessment, but an accurate one. When your core value to the people around you is entirely based on your economic and artistic output, your personal physical deterioration is often ignored as long as the output continues. His public denial was a shield, but his private reality was total isolation. Admitting he needed help might have meant losing his status, losing his livelihood, and losing the approval of the community that depended on him.
It's agonizing. He was trapped by his own generosity, and ultimately, masking his physical exhaustion with drugs led his body to simply surrender. In May of 1999, he is on tour in Brazil. His immune system and his lungs are so weakened from years of drug abuse and asthma that when he catches pneumonia, his body simply lacks the white blood cells to fight it off.
He spends a month in a hospital in Miami trying to recover. But eventually he decides to fly back home to Kingston. On that flight, he tells his brother Leroy that he has severe chills.
He lands and immediately checks into the University of the West Indies Hospital. And the next morning, June 30th, 1999, Dennis Brown dies. He was only 42 years old.
The official medical cause of death was reported as pneumonia and heart failure, heavily exacerbated by his long-standing lung problems. But almost immediately, a new wave of rumors started.
Yeah, there were loud, unconfirmed whispers circulating that he actually died of AIDS. The rumors stem from reports that two of his former girlfriends had recently died of the disease. Furthermore, no autopsy was performed, which only fueled the public speculation. His brother Leroy fiercely defended his legacy, pointing out to the media that Dennis was never officially diagnosed with AIDS. Leroy begged the world to look past the sensationalized tabloid headlines and asked them to find the true Dennis in the lyrics he left behind.
It's a tragic situation, but if we synthesize these conflicting narratives, whether the final blow was severe pneumonia or complications from AIDS, the underlying, undeniable medical truth remains exactly the same. The machinery of his lifestyle, the grueling tour schedules demanded by his community, and the severe drug use facilitated by the industry utterly destroyed his immune system.
Absolutely destroyed it.
His body was a fatally compromised vessel long before he boarded that plane from Miami.
It breaks my heart when you look at the content of what he actually sang about. He told an interviewer once that he viewed himself as a shepherd in his work. He explicitly stated, "I don't want to sing and not live it. I must live it." He was writing these deeply peaceful, spiritual, unifying lyrics about love and community, while his actual day-to-day reality was a chaotic, drug-fueled, high-stress grind that completely contradicted that peace. He was manufacturing a spiritual medicine for the world that he couldn't seem to swallow himself.
That level of cognitive dissonance must have been deafening for him. To be globally revered as a spiritual guide and a provider for your community, while privately feeling like you were drowning without a life raft.
So we step back and look at the whole arc of this deep dive. We have a boy from Beat Street whose voice was so golden, so undeniably powerful, that it ended up financially supporting an entire community. He was the breadwinner, the cultural icon, the reliable hitmaker. But when the pressure of carrying all that weight became too great, he couldn't find anyone willing to truly support him. He gave every ounce of his energy to the crowd, to the promoters, and to his entourage, and at the end of the day, there was nothing left for Dennis.
He was treated as a commodity first and a human being second. And that conditioning started at the age of 9.
And that is exactly what I want to leave you with today. I want you to really mull this over. When a child is turned into a financial commodity at 9 years old, when their art, their voice, and their livelihood belong to the world before they even have a chance to figure out who they actually are, is it ever truly possible for them to separate their intrinsic self-worth from their ability to perform? If you've only ever been loved and rewarded for what you produce, how do you learn to love yourself when the music finally stops?
It recasts his entire life story. The Crown Prince wasn't sitting comfortably on a throne. He was trapped by the very crown he was given.
A jarring contrast indeed. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the sources today. We dug deep, and hopefully you're walking away with a much clearer, if heavier, understanding of the man behind the music. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the headlines, and we will catch you on the next Deep Dive.